Here now is Stone Phillips.
It is something that's been on the minds of many Americans. Are the terrorists planning another attack? And next time, will they try to use chemical or biological weapons? Chemical weapons have already been used once by a terrorist group in Japan. How likely is a chemical or biological attack here? And how do we protect against it? Victoria Corderi, part of NBC's Terrorism Task Force, has more.
These scenes were once unthinkable. Now experts are concerned about another terrorist arsenal, silent, odorless killers that could unleash unprecedented panic.
How real is the threat of biological or chemical attack?
It's much more real than the threat, for example, of a nuclear attack.
Like many, Senator Joseph Biden, who recently presided over hearings on chemical and biological weapons, says the threat is now more real than ever. Since the September 11th attacks, authorities reportedly found crop dusting manuals in one of the suspected terrorists' hiding places. And alleged ringleader Mohammed Atta visited this airstrip in Florida to ask about crop dusters. The fear is that terrorists were trying to get a hold of a plane so they could disperse chemical or biological weapons and cause mass casualties.
We have not focused on basic garden variety terrorist activities that could take place that could do a significant amount of damage but cost a lot of money to deal with it.
There are dozens of biological agents that could be used as weapons, but the two that concern authorities most are anthrax and smallpox. Anthrax is a bacterium that would have to be disseminated by an aerosol and is not contagious. It will infect only those who inhale the germs. Smallpox is a lethal virus that also is spread by a spray. But unlike anthrax, it is highly contagious and could bring about an epidemic. Another route for terrorists to take is to contaminate the water supply. But experts say that is highly unlikely, and the terrorists would have to use poison or biological agents in huge quantities.
A bioterrorist event would unfold like a disease epidemic. Most likely it would be a silent release. We wouldn't even know that we'd been attacked until cases started to appear days or weeks later.
Dr. Peggy Hamburg's specialty is bioterrorism. She has participated in mock exercises like this one that tests a city's capability for dealing with a chemical or biological attack.
Terrorist point of view would be what? The destabilization of the population fighting over vaccines or hysteria? What would be the payoff?
Unfortunately, disruption, devastation, illness, and death, one could produce quite dramatic effects.
But that's not the case with chemical weapons, like those used by Saddam Hussein on the Kurds in the 1980s. They have an immediate effect, causing physical symptoms such as convulsions and burning eyes. In 1995, a cult in Japan released sarin gas in a subway, killing a dozen people and injuring hundreds. That is the only known use of chemical weapons by a terrorist group.
The sarin gas attack, I think, was a wake-up call about the vulnerability of civilian populations and also the motivations of certain terrorist groups.
It was once the stuff of spy fiction, but experts in and out of government say chemical and biological terrorism is now a cold reality the United States needs to accept and defend against. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's feared that biological weapons and the know-how, once so closely guarded, are being sold to rogue nations and terrorist groups.
And experts say in the former Soviet Union there are vast quantities of chemical weapons which have yet to be destroyed, as well as large amounts of biological cultures in labs that are no longer secure from theft or sabotage.
At the time that we entered it, the security had a little bit of barbed wire and one guard. And that was
Senator Richard Lugar testified at the bioterrorism hearings that his visit 3 years ago to former Soviet Union labs that develop anthrax was frightening.
They have a lot of the stuff. They have it in vials. They have it in ice boxes that they have shown to us.
What scares me is the possibility that a very wealthy terrorist group that has excellent international connections could recruit people who worked in weapons laboratories.
Jonathan Tucker is an expert on chemical and biological warfare.
Former Soviet scientists who are now unemployed or underemployed and desperate to feed their families might be tempted to, if they're offered an enormous sum of money, might be tempted to provide some of their deadly know-how to the highest bidder.
The CIA says several countries possess strong chemical and biological weapons programs, including Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. The same countries accused of aiding terrorist groups. For at least 10 years, biological and chemical weaponry have been part of Saddam Hussein's arsenal in Iraq. During the Gulf War, coalition forces bombed a baby formula factory believed to be a biological weapons plant. And several years after the war, Iraq stopped cooperating with UN weapons inspectors. The Clinton administration responded with an anti-terrorism initiative in the mid-1990s, but experts uniformly say not enough has been done. Agencies do not coordinate well during emergency exercises. There aren't enough stockpiles of drugs or vaccines for biological terror, and there's not enough money for research and detection. And physicians, the first line of defense, may mistake the symptoms for the flu.
Our physicians are not prepared for these kind of new threats. Our laboratories don't routinely make these kind of diagnoses and are not adequately prepared.
If bioterrorism is really the poor man's neutron bomb, or real potential threat, why hasn't it happened?
You know, I can't speak to that. You know, who knows? We're grateful that it hasn't, but I think it would be naive to believe that simply because it hasn't happened in the past, it won't happen in the future.
But maybe the reason it hasn't happened is because it is much more difficult to execute than most people realize. For example, the terrorists in Tokyo tried to release anthrax several times and failed before they resorted to the sarin gas. And even then, the gas killed only a dozen people and not hundreds more, because the delivery system the terrorists concocted was crude.
It's probably at greater risk driving on the highway than of being infected with anthrax.
Jonathan Tucker says America should prepare, but this is not a time for alarm.
People who know what is going on are saying it is highly likely that is the next battlefront. Biological terror, chemical terror, and that we are highly unprepared for it. Those are very frightening statements.
Right. Part of that...
Are they overblown?
They may be overblown. I think part of the... you have to understand that to get the attention of Congress and the American people, one has to make statements of that type.
Tucker says large amounts of chemical weapons are needed to have any impact. For example, a ton of chemicals would be needed to cover only 2 miles, and disseminating it is difficult. Biological weapons could reach more people, but Tucker says they are tricky to acquire and even more difficult to disseminate.
If we know there is an actual attack that is an intention to spread something, there are a lot of very basic things we can do to significantly diminish the health hazard and keep order.
Already the government is taking precautions. It's issued a warning to public health officials to be on the lookout for clusters of disease, and to the trucking industry to watch for suspicious activity regarding the transportation of chemicals. Many waterways are being supervised and monitored for tampering.
There's rational things we can do that can significantly alter the landscape and the threat to Americans and others. It's horrible this happened, but I'm glad now we're beginning to focus on those things.
We should let you know that smallpox virus is almost impossible to obtain. Only 2 strains that we know about exist, one in Russia and one at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. For an interactive look at chemical and biological weapons, the symptoms they induce, and how well we're prepared for these kinds of attacks, log on to our website. The address is dateline.msnbc.com.
Still ahead, as workers bring down one last piece of the World Trade Center, a nation struggles to lift its spirits up. When Dateline continues after this brief message.